Hi, everyone, and welcome back to California Transportation 101, a comprehensive overview of how transportation works in California. This work is sponsored by NRDC, so we'd like to thank them for supporting this work so we can all have a better understanding of this landscape. And again, I am Jeanie Ward-Waller, your host for this series. I am the Director of Transportation Advocacy with Fearless Advocacy. All right, and this is part 3 of our series. If you missed parts 1 and 2, please go back and watch those. But this one is going to be a deep-ish dive on California's very complicated transportation funding landscape. And with that, let's jump in. First, I just want to start with some definitions because there are a lot of different terms that we use when we're talking about funding and how funding gets assigned to projects. It's important to have an understanding of these terms in particular. So appropriation is a term that refers to when the legislature in the Annual Budget Act authorizes agencies to use specific funding amounts for purposes that they have specified. So as I've said, this happens through the Annual Budget Act and the various sometimes trailer bills that get attached to the budget. And that is at that point where the funding is authorized. Programming then happens at the agency level, and agencies often are programming funding into the future. So programming is the act of prioritizing and selecting projects for funding. And I like to think of this as sort of a promise of funding, a promise to dedicate funding amounts out of certain programs to specific transportation projects. Obligation is another term that gets used. I hear it most often in reference to federal funds. And that is because the federal government operates on a reimbursement basis. So obligation is when they enter into a contract to legally promise to pay for a project. That happens through either a grant award or the execution of a contract. And then finally, allocation. Allocation is when the funds are actually distributed. So they get programmed for projects into the future, and then those agencies or the sponsors of the project come back for their allocation or their distribution of funds once they're actually ready to build the project and use the funds. So in this section here in part 3 of the series, I'm going to talk about these major funding sources. So I'm going to got a number of slides on this because it's quite complicated, but I'm going to start by talking about our gas taxes and registration fees at the federal and state level in California. I'm going to also talk about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is another state source of funding for transportation. Then I'm going to talk about some recent general fund allocations. These have been one-time funding allocations out of the general fund, and they in the past were quite rare to allocate general funds to transportation, but they've been significant enough in recent years that I think it's important to highlight those. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the major source of local transportation funding, which is the sales tax measures, local sales tax measures dedicated to transportation. And I mentioned in the last part about transportation agencies that we have these self-help counties that have passed a measure and raised funds locally to pay for transportation. Those are those sales tax measures. All right, so let's get into it. I want to just highlight this as a resource. I'm not going to describe this, somewhat complicated diagram in any detail, but I did want to just mention this resource. This is a guidebook that Caltrans publishes every year. They update a new version. This is the 2024 version that you're looking at that's linked on the top of the slide there. But this is a very useful resource. This is a resource that talks about all of the different funding sources, revenue sources, and the programs that they fund in California. This is another resource for those who really want to go deep. This is deeper than the 101 version, but what I'm showing you here is a photo I took of a document called Chart C. And you may hear this referenced when you're talking to transportation people and specifically state budget folks, but Chart C is the very complex labyrinth of funding. It's a diagram that Caltrans, again, produces and updates every year, and it shows you all of the various funding flows, their revenue sources across the top, all of the different accounts and programs that they flow through and to, and you can go real deep. I printed this. It required 16 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper to print, and just laid it out on the floor and took a picture of it just to give you a sense of how complicated this funding landscape is. And I'm going to do my best on the next several slides to actually kind of give you what is a simplified version of Chart C, and my best attempt to kind of break this down and make it more understandable. So this is Chart C, my recreated version of it. These are all the both federal and state gas tax and registration fees, which are the major sources of revenue for transportation in our state. On the left side, in the green boxes, those are the revenue sources. That's where the funding is coming from. Don't pay too much attention to the size of the boxes. They're not certainly to scale, but I did attempt to sort of make the bigger funding pots larger just to give you a little bit of a sense, but they're not accurately scaled. But you can see, the various revenue sources on the left. I'm going to break this chart down actually over the next several slides, so you don't have to absorb this all at one time. But I did just want to show you sort of the full picture. This is really just a simplified diagram of what Chart C represented on the previous slide. All right, so this is my breakdown. So I start first with the revenue sources, and I'm going to walk through each of these. So the biggest pot of revenue source for transportation are our motor vehicle fuel sales and excise, as well as diesel excise taxes. These are state fuel taxes, state gas taxes that are limited under the California Constitution, Article 19. Often hear about Article 19 if you work in this area for very long. Article 19 has some specific provisions that relate to how these funds must be used. And note that it limits these funds to being used on streets, highways, and public transit guideways. So notably absent from that is the operations of public transit. These funds cannot be used to operate public transit. And also note, as I show on the slide there, that the restrictions in Article 19 apply not just to these revenues as they exist today, but also to any replacement of the revenue. So there's a provision in Article 19 that says if any of these revenue sources are replaced by a new source, that new source must also be constrained in the same way by Article 19. The next box on the slide, the next biggest revenue source is the Federal Highway Trust Fund. These are the federal transportation dollars that come to the state, primarily from federal gas tax, but also from the federal general fund in more recent years. These funds flow through the state budget, so they do show up. That's why they're in Chart C, because they do flow through our state budget. Caltrans is responsible for managing them, and these dollars, the formula dollars from the federal government, get split 60% to the state, or 60% stay with Caltrans for investment in the state highway system, and 40% get pass through Caltrans essentially to regional and local agencies. And I've added another little footnote here. That 60%, 40% split is not a mandate. You won't find it in state law anywhere, but it is a handshake agreement. It is a long-standing deal between the local and regional agencies and Caltrans over many years. And anytime there's a new federal bill, that 60-40 split is, really just assumed that they will continue that split of funding. And that goes back to, if you listen to part one, my understanding is the basis for that 60-40 split is because about 60% of the driving in the state happens on the state highway system. Because the state highway system is so impacted, carries so much of the travel, we invest 60% of the federal formula funding on the state system. All right, the next bucket of revenues come from something called a transportation improvement fee. This is a registration fee on vehicles in the state, and this is assessed based on the vehicle's value. Raises about 2.5 billion per year in the state. The next bucket is diesel sales taxes. And note, this is a category of motor vehicle fuel that is distinct from the other kinds of fuels and excise taxes at the top, in the top bucket. And that's because diesel sales tax is the source of fuel taxes that are dedicated to public transit operations. So that's really important. Not constrained by Article 19, as I talked about at the top. And then the very last bucket, this is the smallest pot of revenues, although this is a growing pot. It grows year over year because this is assessed on electric vehicles. And this is just a flat fee, but it is indexed to inflation. And as we have more electric vehicles on the road, as they increase in just the size of the fleet, the number of users, this pot will also continue to grow. All right. So the next set of boxes here on the diagram that I've created, these are the major funding accounts that the revenues come into the state and then they flow into these accounts. And then from the accounts, they get distributed out to different funding programs. So I'm just going to briefly describe these accounts. I do think they are important to know because they have different rules that govern them. So the big pot of revenues, that motor vehicle fuels tax pot that I talked about, is constrained by Article 19. All of that money flows into something called the Highway Users Tax Account. The Highway Users Tax Account is described in Article 19, and that is essentially, we refer to it as the lockbox, that this account is constrained by Article 19, and so a lot of the funding, that whole bucket, big bucket of funds flow through that account so that it can be constrained by Article 19. From there are two other accounts, the State Highway Account, which is the longstanding account for maintenance of the state highway. This primarily funds Caltrans for highway maintenance and operation. This is also the bucket that funds the State Highway Operation and Protection Program, or the SHOPP. That is the account that receives all of the federal formula funds from the federal government. It also receives some of the registration fee funding, and then a big chunk of the funding from the Highway Users Tax Account also flows into the State Highway Account. The Road Maintenance and Rehab Account is a little bit of a smaller account, still quite large, obviously, as you can see there, over 6 billion. And that account, the RMRA, was created under Senate Bill 1 in 2017. So this is a newer account, but it does receive quite a bit of funding, both from the Highway Users Tax Account as well as from the other revenue sources there. The registration fee, the new registration fee assessed on zero emission vehicles, and the RMRA funds primarily road maintenance. It also funds some newer capital programs that were established under Senate Bill 1. And then the last account there, the smallest account, is the public transportation account. This receives those diesel sales taxes that I talked about are available for public transit operations. And it also helps to fund state planning as well as state managed rail and transit. All right, so those are the accounts. And then next I want to talk about the programs. So the funding is flowing through the accounts into these various programs. And these programs that I'm going to highlight on this slide are specifically the ones that fund streets and highways primarily. Although I note under this category, when you're funding streets and highways, this funding is also eligible to fund things like complete streets, so sidewalks and bike lanes, any kind of climate resilience or adaptation improvements to streets and highways, environmental mitigation, which is often required through CEQA or NEPA, and technology and electrification, so things like investing in electric vehicle charging or signals, cameras on the roadway, different kinds of technology that we use to manage our roadways. All right, and the major buckets here, that first one at the top is the Trade Corridor Enhancement Account. This account funds the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, which is one that we talk about a lot, primarily for freight investments, but is a major source of funding for highway expansion projects still in our state. The next bucket is the funding that flows both from the Highway Users Tax Account as well as from the RMRA, goes directly to cities and counties for local street and road maintenance. And then the big bucket, primarily from the state highway account that goes to Caltrans, allows Caltrans to fund their maintenance program, their operations investments, as well as the SHOPP, or the State Highway Operation and Protection Program. That is the biggest program at Caltrans, their biggest responsibility. So we do spend a lot of time focused on the SHOPP. And I tried to sort of depict that the SHOPP is a subset of that bigger $11 billion pot. It's the biggest bucket in that larger bucket. So it's about roughly $5 billion a year. All right, and then I think this is my last slide in this series, kind of breaking down this chart. But this slide is showing you the other, what we sort of think about as the multimodal program. So these aren't exclusively just for funding streets and roads. These can be used for transit. They can be used for rail. There's a bigger variety of things that can be funded in these various programs. And just a few that I highlight are local assistance programs, the bucket at the very top in pink. That is the local assistance program. So this is federal funding that flows through Caltrans and is, flows down to regional and local agencies. And there's a bunch of different subsets within that. I'm not going to get into it, but just know that that's a pretty large portion annually of funds that flow through Caltrans. Transit operations, of course, is an important category. And I talked about how the public transit account receives the diesel sales tax revenue, and it funds the State Transit Assistance Program, which is a formula dollars that go to transit operators that help support their operations. We also have programs like the Active Transportation Program, Local Partnership, Solutions for Congested Corridors Program, as well as the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. This is just a example, a subset, not a comprehensive list, but some of the programs that fall under that SB1 competitive programs pot. And then I think I'm going to talk about this on a future slide, but I'll just briefly mention that the STIP, or the State Transportation Improvement Program, is another bucket. It's a significant program, and it's one that we focus on because it is very flexible funding. There are a lot of eligible uses for those funds, and that money gets programmed or decided how it will be invested at the county level, as well as there's a portion that is Caltrans controlled. I want to just briefly highlight, while we're talking about these different funding programs, that NRDC produced this report recently, and it's available on their website, that essentially give grades to these different state funding programs. And you can see there on the right that they kind of run the gamut in terms of their value for, particularly for their climate benefit or climate impact. And NRDC evaluated all the projects that have been funded over several years out of these different programs based on their VMT impact, or how they would increase driving or have a reducing effect on driving, and then scored the various programs. So really important to know kind of how these programs stack up in terms of their benefit to our climate goals and equity and community health goals. All right, so in summary, I just show you this slide again, and note at the top there in the highlighted text that all of this revenue that shows up in the state budget, state transportation budget, represents about $20 billion annually. So these numbers are 25, 26 budget numbers. They do shift a little bit from year to year, but on average, this is about $20 billion a year dedicated to transportation investment. All right. Now I'm going to shift to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or GGRF. This is money that's raised through California's Cap and Invest program. And I think it's important to note here, so there have been a significant amount of GGRF dollars that have been dedicated to transportation really since the very beginning. So the continuous appropriations of GGRF dollars was established, I believe, back in 2014. So more than the last 10 years, there have been continuous appropriations out of the GGRF to, as you see on the left there, 25% has gone to the high-speed rail project. 20% has gone to a program called Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities, which includes eligibility for transit and active transportation, as well as affordable housing development. 10% has gone to the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program that CalSTA awards and manages, and then 5% to the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program. So over the life of the GGRF and up until this last budget year, 25-26, those have been continuous appropriations that have at least in part funded transportation directly and transportation that contributes to reducing climate emissions. Starting next year in the 26-27 budget year and going forward, those continuous appropriations were changed from percentages of the overall GGRF pot of funds to funding amounts. And those funding amounts could change, could be slightly lower in a year where there is lower revenue. So that's something we'll definitely be keeping an eye on going forward. But this is the amounts you see here on the slide are the intended amounts to continue to go to these important programs into the future. So $1 billion is guaranteed to high-speed rail, 800 million, 400 million, and 200 million to the other three programs you see listed here. In total, that amounts to, or should amount, except in years where there may be lower revenue, to about 2.4 billion annually that comes from the GGRF and helps to fund transportation. So definitely another major source. And then thirdly, I want to highlight these general fund investments that have been made, particularly in recent years. So there were a couple of years where there were budget surpluses. So there was an opportunity to make some significant investments. Governor Newsom was very focused on having a very large climate package. So he really wanted to invest in different programs and investments at the state level that would help address climate change. And so in 21 and 22, the amounts you see here on the left were allocated to some important transportation programs. For the active transportation program specifically, that 1.05 billion investment was a major boost because that is a program that's funded roughly with about 250 million a year in base funding. So that was a major boost. And same with the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. And then there were these two smaller programs that were smaller but important programs that were created at the same time for a program called Highways to Boulevards, as well as a climate adaptation and resilience investment program. And I do just note at the bottom there that the general fund shortfalls, even though there were these major and important investments made in the past, more recent years we have had general fund shortfalls. And so that has resulted in reductions and fund shifts of some of those amounts to actually reduce the investment in those various programs. And then in 23-24, there was a major bill, SB 125, that dedicated significant transit funding as kind of emergency relief to transit agencies that they faced a fiscal cliff coming out of the pandemic. That bill, SB 125, also established the Transit Transformation Task Force, which has just delivered a report to the legislature. And allocated an additional 5.1 billion to both the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, as well as a new zero emission transit capital investment. All right. And then the fourth category of transportation funding, this is really important. This is that locally raised transportation funding based on ballot measures that are passed at the county level to increase the sales tax and dedicate those funds to transportation. Those measures typically include a pretty specific expenditure plan or project list so that there's a required amount of each measure's revenue that has to go to different investments. And the self-help counties, the local agencies responsible for these measures are pretty dedicated to those expenditure plans. Their slogan is promises made, promises kept. So once those measures are passed and those expenditure plans are approved, those projects really do get locked in, even as policy and priorities at the state level may change over time. And you can see on this table on the right side, these are all of the current self-help measures or county measures, and you can see the time horizon when they were adopted and how long they will last, and then the estimated amount of revenue that they generated. This is based on 2024 numbers, but the total there, again, as you see at the bottom, I've highlighted these measures raise about $8.2 billion annually in 2024 dollars. So this is another significant amount of transportation funding that is generated locally. All right, and just to wrap up this section, I want to leave you with a few kind of highlights or takeaways on transportation funding. So in total, when we look at the chart C, the 20 billion that flows through the state budget for transportation, when we look at GGRF, it's a continuous appropriated investment in transportation, specifically in climate beneficial programs, and then also including those local sales tax dollars, which are also generated annually. There's 30 billion, more than 30 billion invested annually in transportation in California from a whole variety of sources. Those funding flows, as we saw in the chart, they're very complex, and there are some very specific constraints on different revenue sources and funding types. But I think it's important to realize that changes can be made. And I talked about the 60-40 state-local split of how federal dollars get managed. And that is, again, a handshake agreement. It's not a requirement in state law. So there are areas where changes can be made, and certainly the legislature can reevaluate decisions that they've made as well as we go forward to better align investments with policy. And as I highlighted in showing the slide about the NRDC report, these funding programs vary significantly in alignment or misalignment with our climate and equity goals. So that really requires important and targeted advocacy to try to make changes to what gets funded out of those programs. All right, and that concludes part 3 of this series. You should now have a better understanding of transportation funding and the very complicated landscape. There's certainly a lot more to dig into, but I hope this gave you at least a 101 level understanding of our transportation funding. And I hope you will come back for part 4. You can find today's slides in the video description.